Hi, my name is Stephanie Whitehorse, and I'm a registered patent agent working with the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. I wanted to take a couple minutes today to talk with you about common questions asked by students when it comes to patents and inventions. The three most common questions are, first, if I tell someone about my idea, can I still apply for a patent? Second, do I have to build my invention in order to apply for a patent? And third, who owns my invention if I create it as part of my coursework on campus? Let's get to the first question. If I tell someone my idea, can I still apply for a patent of my invention? And the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on when you first disclosed your idea and in what countries do you hope to seek patent protection. Let's delve into that a little bit further. This really stems from the issue of public disclosure. So we'll talk a little bit more about the definition of public disclosure after I first explain to you how public disclosure applies to U.S. patent law. Public disclosure of an invention by the inventor more than 1 year before filing for your patent application would pretty much eliminate all of your U.S. patent rights. This comes from the patent law. It's 35 U.S.C. of the patent statute, section 102B. And I'm just going to read you the quotation, and then I'll go into a little bit further explanation so that it actually is more meaningful to you. The statute says, a person shall be entitled to a patent unless the invention was patented or described in a printed publication in this or a foreign country or in public use or on sale in this country more than a year prior to the application for patent in the United States. So let's talk about what constitutes a public disclosure. It's not a particularly difficult list, however, it's worth going through the motions of explaining it. A traditional printed publication that you would normally think of, a journal article, a manuscript published, a thesis once it's cataloged in the library, all of these are considered to be public disclosures. Posting the idea of your invention on a website is also considered to be public disclosure. On occasion, there are special circumstances where you can do password protection. If you limit who actually has access to the password and access to the website, you can sometimes circumvent the issue with public disclosure. But in general, posting on a website can be considered a public disclosure. If you give a poster presentation, which commonly occurs with student inventors working in a course, often there are these forums at the end of the semester where all the students put together posters. The poster presentation itself is considered a public disclosure. If you give a presentation to your class, if the class contains multiple groups of students all working on different projects, the class presentation itself is considered a public disclosure. The thing to keep in mind here is none of the other students in the class have an obligation to keep your invention confidential, and therefore it's considered a public disclosure. In addition, the statute talks about public use. If you have used your invention publicly, that starts the clock ticking for your 1 year. The important thing to note here is you don't have to have used your invention publicly in a way that others could understand exactly what the invention is or how it works. You just have to have used it publicly. There are a few exceptions for experimental use. For example, if you're doing some testing on your invention and it's a very large-scale invention and the only way to test it is out in public, for example, it's some kind of an aircraft device, you can get an exception on the public use. However, once you get beyond the point of experimentation, the public use becomes non-experimental and the 1 year starts ticking. Non-confidential disclosures with any other person who has no obligation to keep your invention confidential can be considered a public disclosure. So if you're working on an invention and you chat with a friend or someone at the bar, that could be considered a public disclosure. In addition, offer for sale of your invention starts the clock ticking for your patent rights. Again, considered a public disclosure in the U.S. patent law. And this, similar to public use, is a case where you don't have to describe exactly what your invention is or how it works. Simply saying to someone, I have this new invention, would you like to buy it, could be considered an offer for sale and start the clock ticking. I'm going to touch very briefly on international patent rights and public disclosure because for some technologies the market is very worldwide and you would want to get some international patent protection. Each country has their own patent law, although a lot of them are very similar to U.S. patent law. When it comes to public disclosure, however, most countries differ. In most countries, you do not have a grace period from your public disclosure. So in other words, you have to file your patent application prior to your public disclosure in order to protect your patent rights. This is particularly true in Europe. The exceptions are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which do have a one-year grace period, similar to the US. Another thing that's worth noting is the use of PCT applications. PCT is the Patent Cooperation Treaty. Most countries where you care about patent law or getting patent protection are members of the PCT, and you can file a single patent application in a single country that's a member of the PCT prior to your public disclosure, and then later use that in order to get patent protection in those countries. So you are not limited to filing patent applications all around the world prior to your public disclosure in order to get protection in those countries. You simply have to file in one country and then later make filings in the other countries. There are lots of time limits on how that's done, but that's a whole nother talk. Let's move on to the next question. This is a simpler question, and so will take a lot less explanation. The question is, do I have to build my invention in order to apply for a patent? And the answer is no. If you actually have built your invention, you've basically constructively, or rather, you've actually reduced your invention to practice. There's another method in which you can apply for a patent using constructive reduction to practice. And this means that you have described in your patent application how to make and use your invention to the extent that someone of ordinary skill in the art, and that is the language from the patent law, would be able to make and use the invention simply by reading your patent application. You also have to have convinced the patent examiner that you have had possession of the invention at the time that you filed the patent application, and you do this, again, by describing in significant detail how to make and use the invention. So you can file a patent application without actual reduction to practice, but you simply have to have constructive reduction to practice. And let's move on to the question of ownership of a patent. Who owns your invention if you create it on campus, if you create it as an employee of a company, if you create it in your garage? The answer is you and your co-inventors. The answer may be the organization where you work. The answer could be the university, or it could be the funding agency who supported the work. The patent law states that a patent is granted to the inventor or inventors in order to prevent others from making and using their invention. So the default is, if no pre-agreement exists, the inventors themselves own their own inventions. However, co-inventors have equal rights to use the invention themselves, equal rights to allow others to use the invention, and they have no obligations to report to each other about the activity of using the invention or allowing others to use the invention. And this is true regardless of who pursues the patent and who pays for the patent application. If in your future career you develop an invention working for a company, you will likely have an obligation to assign all ownership of that invention to the company. This typically is something that you see in confidential disclosure agreements that you sign when you were first employed by a company. Sometimes you'll have a separate document that they'll ask you to sign specifically addressing inventions. But it's very uncommon for a company not to take all title to inventions that you create while employed by them. Something to keep in mind as you move forward in your career. Ownership of inventions at the UW, and this is obviously very relevant to student inventors working in student design courses. If you develop an invention as part of a class project under the University of Wisconsin policy, the inventors are actually allowed to own their own patents. This is an unusual policy, different from most other universities in the country. There are a couple of exceptions here at the UW to that general policy, and those have to do with whether or not you had specific funding for making the invention. If you had specific funding from a company, and that company, when they gave the gift of funding to the university, put together IP obligations, then you may have an obligation to assign your invention to the university or to WARF. And if you have federal dollars that were used to support making and using the invention, you'll have an obligation to assign the invention to WARF. However, if WARF or the university choose not to pursue patent protection, the default of ownership goes back to the federal granting agency, and it does not divert back to the inventors. So I hope that these questions have been the kind of questions that have come to your mind, and I hope my answers will help you as you pursue patents in your design course and in your career in the future. Thank you.